I had been caught. The realization hit me with the same nauseating clarity as the moment 8 years ago when I discovered my 0.004% rounding error, the decimal point that had ended my career, my reputation, and any illusion I'd had about being the kind of man who could be trusted with lives. But this time, the mistake wasn't mathematical. It was human. Embarrassingly, painfully human. I had spent the last 47 minutes staring at the primary navigation array of the Prometheus Dawn with what I hoped looked like professional intensity. The array was functioning at peak efficiency. It had been functioning at peak efficiency for the past 6 hours. I was running a redundant diagnostic for the fifth time that shift, my fingers dancing across the haptic interface with all the urgency of a man desperately trying to look busy while doing absolutely nothing productive. The truth was simpler and infinitely more mortifying. I was using the navigation console's reflective surface to watch Dr. Lyra Stellaris work. The Prometheus Dawn was a relic from the mid-century mining boom, all cramped corridors and recycled air that perpetually smelled like burnt ozone and industrial lubricant. It was not a ship designed for privacy or comfort. It was a ship built for one purpose: scraping rare minerals from the frozen bones of dead asteroids in the Caladrius Expanse, a region of space so remote that even the Synaptic Union's tax collectors thought twice before making the journey. Dr. Stellaris sat less than 3 meters away at the shared research console, her back to me, analyzing core samples from the latest mineral survey. To describe her as beautiful would have been to admit that the English language, hell, that human language itself, was woefully inadequate for certain tasks. Her skin was a biological marvel, a semi-translucent lattice of crystalline structures that shifted colors like living stained glass. In the cold blue light of the navigation bay, she moved through shades of smoky quartz to brilliant diamond clarity, each subtle shift corresponding to some internal process I couldn't begin to understand. Her oral spires, the elegant horn-like structures where a human would have ears, rose from the sides of her head in graceful arcs, constantly vibrating with a frequency I could feel more than hear. It was a sensation that lived somewhere between sound and touch, a humming that resonated in my sternum and made my back teeth ache in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. She moved with a liquid precision that suggested she found gravity to be more of a polite suggestion than a fundamental law of physics. Every gesture was economical, purposeful. When she reached for a data slate or adjusted the holographic display, there was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She was, in every measurable way, the most competent person I had ever worked with, which made my behavior all the more pathetic. This was the 22nd time this shift that I had directed my visual attention toward her when I should have been focused on literally anything else. I knew this because I had been keeping count, the same way I used to track variables in atmospheric entry calculations back when people still trusted me to do atmospheric entry calculations. Captain Wright. Her voice was a revelation every single time I heard it. Crystalline vocal anatomy produced a multitonal effect, like a cello being played in a cathedral, each word arriving with harmonic overtones that made my neural pathways light up in configurations they definitely hadn't evolved for. The first time she'd spoken to me 6 weeks ago, I'd actually taken a step backward, physically overwhelmed by the acoustic complexity of her saying, "Pleased to meet you." I looked up from my console, trying to arrange my face into something approximating professional competence. "Dr. Stellaris, what couldn't I do for you?" She hadn't moved. Her back was still to me, her fingers still dancing across her own interface. But her oral spires had rotated a full 180 degrees, angled directly at me like organic satellite dishes. "You are engaging in repetitive visual observation of my position," she said, her tone carrying no inflection I could interpret as anger or amusement, pure statement of fact. "This behavior has occurred with marked frequency during our shared duty shifts. I have been recording the statistical pattern." My throat went dry. The embarrassment was so acute it felt like a physical thing, a hot pressure building behind my eyes and crawling up the back of my neck. I could feel the blood rushing to my face, the treasonous bloom of crimson that every human being experiences when caught doing something they shouldn't. "I'm not staring," I managed to say, and even to my own ears it sounded like the weakest tactical defense in the history of human communication. My voice cracked slightly on the word staring, which was just perfect. Nothing says I am a 34-year-old man with 2 doctorates in celestial cartography and a decade of deep space experience, quite like your voice breaking like a nervous teenager's. I cleared my throat, tried again. I'm merely monitoring the peripheral reflections in the console glass. Safety protocols, you know how it is. Can't be too careful about visual anomalies in shared workspaces. There was a pause. The kind of pause that exists purely to let you know that everyone in the conversation understands you are lying and that they are giving you one final opportunity to reconsider your commitment to that lie. Lyra's spires rotated forward again, resuming their standard position. She still hadn't turned to face me. That response demonstrates poor tactical reasoning, Captain Wright. The navigation console's reflective coefficient is insufficient for meaningful peripheral monitoring at your current angle and distance. Additionally, this is the 22nd occurrence of this behavior pattern since we entered the inner rim of the Caladria system. The frequency is statistically significant and suggests alternative motivation. 22. She had been counting. Of course she had been counting. She was a scientist. Observation was her primary function. And I had apparently been as subtle as a solar flare. "You've been recording it?" I heard myself ask, which was possibly the stupidest response available to me in that moment. Of all the things I could have said, an apology, an explanation, a simple acknowledgement, I had chosen to focus on her data collection methodology. Lyra finally turned to face me, and the full impact of her presence hit me like it did every single time. Her eyes were not like human eyes. They were faceted, crystalline, catching the blue navigation lights and fracturing them into 1,000 tiny sparks. Looking into them was like looking into a prism filled with distant stars. "I am a scientist, Captain Wright," HFY said, and there might have been something in those harmonic overtones that wasn't purely professional interest. "Observation and analysis are fundamental to my discipline. When a variable in my environment behaves with such consistency, it demands systematic study." She stood, her movements as fluid as water finding its level. The standard issue jumpsuit she wore, regulation gray that looked dull and lifeless on everyone else, seemed to take on a silvered sheen against the subtle luminescence of her skin. She crossed the 3 meters between her console and mine in complete silence. Crystallians didn't walk so much as glide, their footfalls making no sound even on the metal deck plating. She stopped just at the edge of what human psychology textbooks referred to as personal space, that invisible boundary we maintain around ourselves, the violation of which triggers automatic discomfort responses. She wasn't violating it exactly. She was respecting it with the precision of someone who had studied human behavioral patterns in academic detail. "So," she said, those impossible eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away and simultaneously made it impossible to do so, "I am initiating a direct inquiry. Why do you consistently direct your visual focus toward my physical form during moments when you believe I am occupied with other tasks?" My brain, which usually functioned with what I like to think was reasonable efficiency, certainly good enough to calculate transatmospheric entry vectors and predict gravitational tidal effects, suddenly decided to take an unscheduled vacation. Every coherent thought I'd ever had packed its bags and left without forwarding information. I could have lied. The lie was right there, ready to deploy. I could have blamed equipment calibration, could have made some excuse about monitoring her workspace for safety compliance, could have deflected with humor, or changed the subject, or done any of the 1,000 small social maneuvers that humans use to avoid uncomfortable truths. But looking at her in that moment, seeing the faint pulse of bioluminescence beneath her crystalline skin, the way her oral spires angled forward in what I had learned was a posture of genuine curiosity, the absolute absence of judgment or mockery in those faceted eyes, the lie simply died in my throat. "Because you look magnificent," I said. The silence that followed was profound, not the empty silence of space, but something heavier, more present. The kind of silence that has weight and texture, that presses against your chest like atmospheric pressure. Lyra's oral spires went perfectly still. It was the first time I'd ever seen them completely motionless, and the absence of their constant, subtle vibration was jarring. Her skin shifted through a rapid cascade of colors, quartz to amber to something that looked like rose-tinted crystal, before settling on a deeper, more opaque shade of violet that I'd never seen her display before. In the terminology of her people, She was processing. I'd learned enough about crystalline physiology to recognize the physical markers of intense cognitive activity. The color shift, the spire stillness, the slight increase in the luminescence at her throat where the major resonance organs were located. Magnificent, she repeated, and the way her multi-tonal voice shaped the word made it sound like a scientific discovery, each syllable examined and analyzed. Her accent, which I couldn't quite place as belonging to any particular region of the crystalline homeworld, elongated the vowels until the words seemed to fill the entire navigation bay. Yeah, I said, leaning back against my console, deciding that if I was going to thoroughly ruin my professional reputation, I might as well be comprehensive about it. Magnificent, stunning, radiant. Take your pick from the entire inadequate human vocabulary for describing something that exists several standard deviations beyond what our evolutionary neurology prepared us to process. I took a breath, felt the recycled air of the ship fill my lungs, and committed fully to what was either brave honesty or career suicide. I know it's unprofessional. I know I'm supposed to be focused on the gravitational anomalies in Sector 9 and the fuel efficiency calculations for our return trajectory. But you walk into a room, Dr. Stellaris, and my cognitive functions just sort of flatline. It's like trying to look at a binary star system without proper optical filtering. You're the most incredible thing I've encountered in 17 light years of deep space service. And believe me when I say I've seen some genuinely impressive astronomical phenomena. Lyra tilted her head, a gesture that was simultaneously alien and somehow familiar, like a bird considering something unexpected. Her aural spires began to vibrate again, but at a different frequency than usual, something lower and more resonant that I felt in my bones. This is not human sarcasm, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. I have been extensively briefed on human communication patterns. Sarcasm, irony, hyperbole as forms of social deception or humor. This statement does not match those patterns. No deception, I said, and my heart was doing something complicated and probably medically concerning against my ribs. Just truth, inconvenient, unprofessional truth, but truth nonetheless. I'm staring because I can't help it. You're a masterpiece of evolutionary biology and physics, and I'm just a guy who spends most of his time looking at rocks floating in empty space. Lyra moved closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent that seemed to cling to her. Something like ozone after a thunderstorm, or the sharp, clean smell of air in high mountains. It wasn't perfume or any artificial scent. It was just her, the natural byproduct of whatever complex biochemistry powered a crystalline metabolism. In crystalline culture, she said, her voice dropping to something quieter, more intimate despite the multitonal harmonics, sustained observation of another individual is typically reserved for two specific contexts. The first is threat assessment, the careful study of a potential danger to determine appropriate defensive response. She paused, and the air between us seemed to thicken with possibility. The second is the evaluation of a potential mate, the detailed observation that precedes bonding decisions. My brain managed to reboot just enough to process those words. What? When I first observed your observation pattern, Lyra continued, I hypothesized that you found my presence threatening. You are a senior navigation officer with extensive experience. I am a recently assigned specialist who has corrected your orbital calculations 3 times in the past week. I theorized that you were conducting threat assessment, possibly planning to file a complaint regarding my interference with established protocols. Intimidated? I heard myself laugh, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the metal walls of the navigation bay. Dr. Stellaris, I'm not intimidated by competence. I'm impressed by it. You found that Ethereum leak in the primary drive before the automated alarms even registered the temperature differential. You recalculated our fuel efficiency and saved us 3 days of transit time. You're brilliant, and that makes the staring problem exponentially worse, not better. Something changed in the way her skin reflected the ambient light. A soft pulse of color rippled from her throat up through her aural spires, a wash of rose and gold that reminded me of sunrise on high-oxygen planets. It was beautiful and completely unconscious, an involuntary physiological response that she probably wasn't even aware of. Your honesty is irregular, she said, and now there was definitely something new in those harmonic tones. warmth maybe, or curiosity. Most of the crew members, particularly the human crew members, maintain significant social distance when interacting with me. They treat me as either an exotic specimen to be carefully observed or as a superior computational tool to be consulted and then avoided. You treat me as a colleague, yet you observe me as if I were, she paused, seemed to search for the right word, as if I were a stellar phenomenon worthy of dedicated study. Maybe because you are, I said quietly. The communications unit on my belt chose that exact moment to chirp with the harsh metallic voice of Captain Helen Blackwood cutting through whatever moment we were having. Right, report to the survey lab. Dr. Stellaris's latest scans have found something anomalous in the belt. We need navigational vectors for a close-range probe deployment. Move it. I keyed the comm. Copy that, Captain. On my way. I started toward the door, then paused, turned back. Lyra was still standing there, her oral spires angled in a configuration I'd never seen before. Slightly back, vibrating with a low resonant frequency that I felt more than heard. For what it's worth, I said, I'm not sorry I said it. I'm just sorry I was obvious enough that you had to compile statistical data to notice. Lyra watched me with those impossible eyes, and I thought I saw something shift in their crystalline depths. I'm not sorry you were obvious, Captain Wright, she called out just as the door hissed shut behind me. It made my observational data collection significantly more interesting. I walked down the corridor toward the survey lab, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. I had told an alien scientist, a being from a completely different evolutionary path, with biochemistry I barely understood and cultural contexts I could only guess at, that she was magnificent. I was either the bravest or the stupidest person currently working in the Caladrius expanse. Probably both. But for the first time in 6 weeks of carefully controlled professional distance, for the first time since she'd walked onto the Prometheus Dawn with her official Synaptic Union documentation and her 3 cases of specialized equipment, the recycled air of the ship didn't smell quite so stale. The metal corridors didn't feel quite so confining. It felt like anything might be possible. Survey Lab 3 was a pressurized environment specifically designed for handling volatile mineral samples, which meant it was the coldest room on the ship and smelled like wet stone and chemical preservatives. I arrived exactly 11 minutes after Captain Blackwood's summons, which was fast enough to avoid a reprimand, but slow enough that she'd know I hadn't sprinted through the corridors like an eager cadet. I was carrying 2 thermal canisters of synthesized coffee, one for me with 4 measured units of sweetener, the optimal amount for surviving a double shift, and 1 black, which was how I'd observed Dr. Stellaris taking hers during our shared late-night work sessions over the past month and a half. You are precisely 2 minutes earlier than my behavioral projection model predicted, Lyra said without looking up from the holographic display that dominated the center of the lab. Her hair, fine silver filaments that caught and refracted light like fiber optics, was tied back in a practical knot. She had changed into a thermal vest over her standard jumpsuit, necessary protection against the lab's deliberately frigid temperature. I took the maintenance stairs instead of the main corridor, I said, offering her the canister. And I brought fuel. Lyra accepted the coffee, and her crystalline fingers brushed against my hand for a fraction of a second. The contact sent a small jolt through my nervous system that had absolutely nothing to do with the ship's electrical grounding and everything to do with the fact that her skin was warm, surprisingly, almost shockingly warm, and the brief touch had felt like completing a circuit I hadn't known was incomplete. She took a sip, and her oral spires perked slightly upward in what I had learned to recognize as pleasure or approval. You remembered the absence of additives. I remember a lot of things, I said, moving to stand beside her at the holographic display. Orbital vectors, fuel consumption rates, coffee preferences. It's my job to track details. Lyra didn't pull away from my proximity. In the 6 weeks since she'd joined the crew, she had maintained careful physical distance from everyone, respecting human social boundaries with the precision of someone who'd studied the anthropological literature. But now, standing beside me in the cold laboratory, she allowed our shoulders to exist in the same general spatial region without retreating. What have we got that's urgent enough to interrupt my scheduled 10-minute period of staring into space while contemplating my life choices? I asked, trying to inject some levity into my voice. I was conducting a comprehensive mineral survey of the asteroid cluster, We have designated XP4, Lyra said, gesturing to the holographic image floating before us. The display showed a jagged, potato-shaped chunk of rock tumbling through space, backlit by the fierce golden glow of the Caladria system's inner sun. Standard protocol for resource evaluation. However, examination of the deep tissue spectral analysis revealed an anomalous signature in the fourth quadrant. I leaned in, my professional instincts overriding everything else. The holographic representation was detailed enough to show the asteroid's internal structure. Layers of different mineral densities represented by color gradients. But buried deep in what would be the asteroid's mantle was a pocket of light so intense it distorted the surrounding data field. The spectral signature was irregular, pulsing with a frequency that didn't match any known element in the standard mining database. It looked less like a mineral deposit and more like something alive, something with a rhythm. "That's not palladium," I muttered, my professional focus narrowing to the anomaly. "It's not even high-grade iridium. The density readings are completely outside normal parameters. And that pulsation pattern, it looks like it's vibrating." "It is vibrating," Lyra confirmed, and there was something in her voice now that I'd never heard before. Excitement, barely controlled. Her skin had shifted to a sharp, clear amber. The color I'd learned indicated intense cognitive engagement. "I have conducted 17 separate scans to verify the data. Captain Wright, I believe we have found ethyl glass." The words hung in the cold air of the laboratory like a physical presence. Ethyl glass, the theoretical substance that existed only in academic papers, and the kind of wild speculation that miners told each other in station bars after too much synthetic alcohol. "Ethyl glass is a myth," I said automatically, the reflexive response of someone whose career had been destroyed by believing in things that turned out not to be true. "It's what old-timers talk about to make rookies waste time chasing shadows. Work hard in school or you'll spend your life hunting glass ghosts in dead asteroid fields." "I do not believe in myths," Lyra said, and her skin was now glowing with that amber intensity. "I believe in empirical data, and the empirical data suggests that we are currently within survey range of the most significant mineral discovery in the history of Caladrius Expanse exploitation." She manipulated the holographic controls and the image zoomed in, enhancing the anomalous region. The pulsing light resolved into greater detail, and I could see that it wasn't uniform. It had structure, complexity, patterns within patterns like fractal geometry made solid. "Ethyl glass is theoretically a biomineral hybrid," Lyra continued, her multi-tonal voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a lecture she'd given many times in her head. "A form of crystalline life that exists in a state of perpetual flux between organic and inorganic states. If these readings are accurate, and I have verified them against 17 independent sensor arrays, a single kilogram of this material could generate sufficient energy to power the Prometheus dawn for a century." My jaw must have dropped because Lyra glanced at me and her oral spires angled in what I'd learned was amusement. "Your facial expression suggests profound skepticism, Captain." 100 years from 1 kilogram, I managed. "Dr. Stellaris, that kind of energy density violates approximately 12 different thermodynamic principles." "It violates human thermodynamic models," she corrected. "Crystalline physics recognizes resonance-based energy storage that your scientific frameworks do not yet adequately describe. Ethyl glass doesn't store energy in chemical bonds or atomic structure. It stores energy in harmonic frequencies, in the spaces between matter. It is fundamentally crystallized song." She turned to face me fully, and I saw something in those faceted eyes that went beyond scientific excitement. There was need there, urgency, something personal that transcended academic interest. "This is why I requested you specifically for this consultation, Captain Wright. The orbital mechanics of XP4 are unstable. The asteroid is currently caught in a three-body gravitational interaction between the gas giant, the inner sun, and the debris field of a shattered moon. Current trajectory projections give us a window of exactly 48 hours before XP4's orbit degrades sufficiently to carry it into the sun's corona. After that point, retrieval becomes impossible." 48 hours. I pulled up the navigational data on my personal slate, running quick calculations. That's an extremely tight operational window, even for a ship with functioning primary drives. We'd need to thread through the debris field, establish a stationary hover position relative to the asteroid's rotation, and maintain that position while extraction drones conducted their work. It's risky, Dr. Stellaris. The gravitational shear forces alone. I am aware of the risks, she interrupted, and her hand reached out to touch my arm. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, and the warmth of her crystalline fingers through my sleeve made me lose my train of thought completely. But I also know that you are the most skilled navigator in this sector. I have reviewed your service record, Captain Wright. Before the colony transport incident, you held the record for the highest number of successful high-risk orbital insertions in the history of the Deep Space Fleet. You have an ability to see paths through chaos that others cannot perceive. You see possibilities where others see only obstacles. She held my gaze, and I felt the weight of that trust like a physical thing. I need you to help me reach that asteroid. I need your skill, your experience, and your willingness to attempt what others would consider impossible. I looked at the holographic asteroid, then back at her. The way the blue light of the display reflected off her skin made her look like she was part of the discovery itself, a being made of the same mysterious substance we were studying. All right, I said, nodding slowly. If you're certain about the data, then I'm certain about finding a path. But we're going to need more than just standard extraction drones. The gravitational fluctuations will be too severe for automated systems to compensate in real time. We'll need a manned shuttle. I have already submitted a request for the Scarab 7, Lyra said. I will serve as the primary scientist for the extraction operation. And I'll be your pilot, I added, not phrasing it as a question. No way I'm letting anyone else fly you into a gravitational meat grinder. Lyra smiled. It was small, just a slight upward curve at the corners of her mouth, but it felt like witnessing a solar event. Your protective instinct is noted, Captain Wright, though I should remind you that crystalline reflexes are approximately 12% faster than human baseline. 12%, I said, matching her smile. Well, I've got something better than superior reflexes. Which is? Luck, I said, and according to my calculations, we're statistically overdue for some. We spent the next 4 hours buried in orbital projections and mineralogical data. We argued about approach angles and thruster burn sequences, our voices rising and falling in the cold air of the laboratory like competing instruments finding harmony. It was the most intellectually engaged I'd been in years, but even while my conscious mind was focused on vectors and fuel calculations, some other part of my awareness was cataloging everything about her. The way her oral spires twitched slightly when she encountered a logical inconsistency in the data. The way her skin became more transparent, almost glass clear, when she reached a satisfying conclusion. The way she never once made me feel like my human limitations were inadequate or burdensome. By the time the ship's chronometer hit 2200 hours, we had constructed a flight plan that was equal parts brilliant mathematics and hopeful prayer. It required absolute precision, split-second timing, and a fair amount of faith that the universe would cooperate with our calculations. You should rest, Lyra said as we packed up our data slates and projection equipment. The mission window opens at 0600 hours. You'll need optimal cognitive function. I will, I promised. But I think I'm going to stop by the observation deck first. The light show from the Caladrius expanse is supposed to be particularly vivid tonight. Something about solar wind interacting with the methane clouds. I know, Lyra said, and there was something in her voice, anticipation maybe. I was planning to observe the phenomenon as well. The resonance patterns of charged particles through organic gas formations are relevant to my research. We walked together through the corridors of the Prometheus Dawn, not quite side by side, but not maintaining the careful professional distance that had characterized our previous interactions. Crew members we passed noted us with varying degrees of interest, though no one commented. The observation deck was a wide curved gallery at the forward section of the ship, offering an unobstructed 270-degree view of the void. When we arrived, the space was empty, just us and the universe beyond the reinforced transparent alloy. Lyra was already there when I walked in, standing at the main viewport. She had changed out of her thermal vest and laboratory jumpsuit into something softer, a flowing wrap in deep blue that seemed to catch and hold every photon that touched it. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of liquid silver. The Caladrius expanse spread before us in all its terrible beauty. Vast clouds of ionized gas in shades of violet and emerald, threaded through with golden lightning from solar-wind interactions. Asteroids drifted through the luminous mist like ancient whales swimming through an ocean of light. I stood beside her at the viewport, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence is its own form of communication, especially when you're standing in front of something that reduces language to inadequacy. In my culture, Lyra finally said, her voice quiet enough that I had to lean slightly closer to hear, we do not have a single word equivalent to your magnificent. We describe things by their resonance, by how they make the world vibrate around them, by the frequencies they introduce into existence. How do I resonate? I asked, surprising myself with the question. But standing there in the dim light of the observation deck, with the universe performing its eternal light show beyond the glass, it felt like the right question to ask. Lyra turned to face me, and her skin was doing something I'd never seen before, a slow ripple of colors that moved from her throat up through her oral spires like a visible heartbeat. Rose and gold, and something that looked like crystallized starlight. You are discordant, she said, and before I could interpret that as criticism, she reached out and took my hand. Her skin was warm, warmer than it had any right to be, a surprise against the perpetual chill of the ship. You are filled with static and uncertainty, Captain Wright. You hide behind humor and calculations because you are afraid of being seen as fundamentally flawed. The colony transport incident created a frequency of fear in you that distorts every other resonance. She interlaced her crystalline fingers with my very human ones, and I looked down at our joined hands, her lattice of living crystal and light, my scarred skin and calluses from a decade of working manual controls. But your resonance is also very strong, she continued. You are kind without expectation of reciprocation. You are brave in ways you do not recognize. And when you look at me, you create a shift in my own resonance that is entirely unprecedented in my experience. I had no words. None. Every clever response I'd ever formulated, every deflection and joke and self-deprecating comment, all of it just evaporated in the warmth of her hand and the absolute honesty in her voice. I am flawed, I finally managed to say. I've made mistakes that cost people money, time, trust. I'm not perfect, Dr. Stewaris, not even close. Perfection is a static state, she said, and now she was close enough that I could see the individual facets of her eyes, each one reflecting a slightly different aspect of the light beyond the viewport. Perfection is for mathematical constants and theoretical ideals. I am not interested in perfection, Captain Wright. I am interested in growth. I am interested in what happens when two different resonances find a way to harmonize. She leaned forward then, slowly enough that I could have moved away if I'd wanted to, but I didn't want to. Her forehead touched mine, and the contact was electric. Not metaphorically, but literally, a bridge of warmth and subtle bioelectric current flowing between two completely different forms of consciousness. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, feeling the vibration of her oral spires against my temples, feeling the warmth of her presence in a cold universe, feeling more seen and understood than I had in 8 long years of hiding in the forgotten corners of space. Tomorrow we go into the storm, I whispered. Yes, she replied, her voice a harmony in the small space between us. But tonight we are here. And I am very glad you were obvious enough in your observations that I could compile statistical data. Thaddeus Wright. The Prometheus dawn hummed around us, a metal shell protecting fragile biological matter from the vast indifferent dark. But inside, in the quiet light of the observation deck, with the universe painting pictures beyond the glass, two people from two different worlds were discovering that the void wasn't quite so empty after all. We were just beginning to find the resonance that mattered. And tomorrow we would see if that resonance was strong enough to survive what came next. The hangar bay of the Prometheus dawn at 5 in the morning was a cavern of organized chaos, a place where the rhythmic thrum of the ship's primary reactors met the staccato hiss of hydraulic systems and the sharp ozone smell of welding torches striking metal. The air was thick with the scent of industrial lubricant and recycled oxygen that had been breathed too many times. I stood before the Scarab 7, our primary long-range extraction shuttle, and felt the familiar cold knot of anxiety tightening in my gut. The shuttle was built more like a reinforced battering ram than an elegant spacecraft, All angular armor plating and redundant systems designed to withstand the crushing gravitational forces and debris impacts of extraction operations in hostile environments. You look like you're about to walk to your own execution, right? I turned to find Chief Engineer Morgan Shaw leaning against a stack of equipment crates, her prosthetic left arm whirring softly as she gestured with a piece of synthetic stimulant root clamped between her teeth. Her face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent 30 years keeping dying ships functional through sheer willpower and creative profanity. Just running final pre-flight checks, Chief, I said, wiping a bead of sweat from my upper lip despite the hangar's chill. The Scarab's been pulling slightly to port since the last mineral run. Want to make sure we're not flying a brick with asymmetric thrust. Shaw snorted, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. She's fine. I recalibrated the thrusters myself last night. Tested every system twice. The shuttle isn't the problem here, Captain. Her eyes, one natural brown, one replaced with a cybernetic unit that glowed faintly amber, fixed on me with uncomfortable precision. You're the one who's misaligned. This isn't a standard extraction run. You're heading into a three-body gravitational clusterfuck with debris fields that'll shred hull plating like tissue paper. If your head isn't completely in the game, you're going to get both of you killed. I'm locked in, Chief, I said, though my hands were doing that subtle betrayal tremor that always appeared before high-risk operations. Just making absolutely certain the numbers are correct. Numbers don't save you when rocks the size of city blocks start playing pinball with your cockpit, Shaw said. But her expression softened fractionally. Instinct does. Trust does. You've got the skill, right? Question is whether you've got the faith in yourself. She pushed off from the crates. Don't overthink the path. Just fly the damn ship. I watched her walk away, her prosthetic arm leaving small grease marks on everything she touched. Overthinking was what I did. It was my defining characteristic, the thing that had gotten me through the academy with top marks and then subsequently destroyed my career when I'd overthought myself into a catastrophic error. 8 years ago, I had been the golden boy of atmospheric entry navigation. 3 graduate degrees, a faculty position waiting at Luna Academy, and a reputation for being able to thread a transport through atmospheric conditions that made other pilots refuse to launch. I had been asked to verify landing calculations for a colony transport carrying 200 settlers to New Perth. I had been exhausted, 70 hours into an 80-hour work week. But I was Thaddeus Wright, the man who never made mistakes, so I'd run the calculations 3 times to be absolutely certain. The third check had been a correction of a correction that didn't need correcting. In my exhausted state, I'd introduced a rounding error of 0.004%. The transport had missed the landing pad by 70 meters, coming down in marshland instead of reinforced concrete. No one had died, the pilots were skilled enough to prevent casualties, but the ship had been totaled. 15 million credits of hardware buried in mud because I couldn't trust my own work, because I had to check and recheck again until I'd created an error where none had existed. My career had ended that day. Not officially. There had been no formal censure, no criminal charges, but everyone knew. The man who couldn't trust his own calculations. The brilliant navigator who'd overthought himself into disaster. Within 6 months, I'd withdrawn from Luna Academy and signed on to the first deep space mining vessel that would take me, running as far from Earth and my failure as physics would allow. The shuttle is prepared for departure, Captain Wright. Lyra's voice pulled me from the spiral of memory. She emerged from behind the tool lockers, and even in the harsh industrial lighting of the hangar bay, she was radiant. She wore a specialized crystalline environmental suit, a series of interlocking flexible plates that mimicked the structure of her own skin, all of it humming with a low resonant frequency that I could feel in my sternum. Ready to go hunting for crystallized myths? I asked, attempting a grin that probably looked more like a grimace. Lyra approached the Scarab 7, her oral spires angling toward the shuttle's hull, in what I'd learned was her way of conducting a sensory inspection. The ship is vibrating with anticipation, she said. Or perhaps that is merely the hydraulic systems reaching operational temperature. She turned those faceted eyes on me, and I saw concern in their crystalline depths. Your own resonance is sharp, jagged, like crystal that has been fractured and poorly repaired. You are dwelling on past frequencies. I climbed into the pilot seat, the leather creaking under my weight. The cockpit of the Scarab 7 was familiar territory. Cramped, utilitarian, everything within arm's reach, because in an emergency, seconds mattered. That's just the caffeine and the prospect of flying into a sunward tumbling rock, Doc. Don't read too much into it. I do not read, Lyra said, settling into the co-pilot's chair with that liquid grace that made me feel like a clumsy assemblage of meat and bone. I observe, and I observe that the ghost warnings you mentioned to Chief Shaw are not in the sensors. They are in your memory. I didn't answer. I focused on the pre-flight checklist, my fingers moving over the tactile switches with the automatic precision of thousands of hours of training. Oxygen levels nominal. Thruster pressure optimal. Resonance drive synchronized. All the numbers lining up like they were supposed to, like they always did right before something went catastrophically wrong. Prometheus Control, this is Scarab 7, I said into the comm system, keeping my voice level and professional. Requesting clearance for departure to Sector 9, extraction mission to designated asteroid XP4. Clearance granted, Scarab 7, the dispatcher's voice crackled back. Female, probably Lieutenant Chen on the morning shift. Be advised, debris field activity is elevated this morning. Solar wind is pushing a lot of loose material through your flight path. Keep your shields hot and your reflexes hotter. Don't get scorched out there. Copy that, Control. Breaking seal now. The hangar bay doors groaned open with the sound of stressed metal, revealing the majestic and terrifying beauty of the Caladrius expanse beyond. It was an ocean of color and chaos, swirling clouds of ionized gas in shades of violet, emerald, and deep indigo. Asteroids moved through the luminous mist like prehistoric creatures, trailing ribbons of frozen volatiles and pulverized rock. And there, dominating the view like a malevolent eye, was the inner sun, a fierce sphere of golden fury that seemed to watch our every movement, waiting for us to make a mistake it could exploit. I eased the throttle forward. The Scarab 7 bucked slightly as it left the artificial gravity of the Prometheus dawn, the thrusters firing with a bass roar that I felt through the pilot seat. The transition from internal atmosphere to vacuum was always disorienting. That moment when you went from being inside something to being inside nothing, with only a few centimeters of hull plating between you and a death that would be both instant and absolute. Engaging pulse resonance drive, I announced, more for my own benefit than Lyra's. My hands moved over the controls, activating the exotic physics that allowed faster than light travel through normal space. The world outside the viewport blurred as the shuttle began to vibrate in harmony with the quantum foam of space-time itself. It wasn't speed in the traditional sense. It was more like the ship was finding gaps in reality and slipping through them, skating along the edge of what was physically possible. The first time I'd experienced resonance drive, I'd spent an hour afterward vomiting into a disposal unit. Now it just felt like driving on a road with slightly too many potholes. Lyra's skin began to glow, a soft rhythmic pulsing that matched the frequency of the resonance drive. She looked out at the expanse with an expression I'd never seen before, something like reverence mixed with profound longing. My people have a legend about this place, she said quietly, almost to herself. They call it the breath of ancestors. They believe that every particle of dust in these clouds carries the memory of a soul that has passed into resonance with the universe. In my culture, I said, fighting to keep the shuttle steady against a sudden gravitational ripple from the nearby gas giant, we just call it a navigational nightmare. Too many variables, too much interference, not enough reliable data to make confident predictions. Noise is merely information you have not yet learned to interpret, Lyra said, her multitonal voice taking on a quality I'd started to recognize as gentle correction. You see a debris field. I see a symphony. Every rock has a frequency. Every cloud has a harmonic signature. It is all music, Captain Wright. You simply need to learn to hear it. Well, let's hope this symphony doesn't have a percussion section that wants to use our hull as a drum, I muttered, banking the shuttle hard to starboard as a cluster of frozen methane crystals the size of small cars went zipping past our port side. The proximity alarm screamed briefly before falling silent as the debris passed. My heart rate, which had spiked into the danger zone, slowly began to settle back towards something approximating normal. We're approaching the first major gravity well, I said, checking the navigational display. The gas giant's influence starts getting serious in about 30 seconds. Hold on to your spires, Doc. This is going to get bumpy. The shuttle groaned as we hit the invisible wall of gravitational force. It wasn't like hitting something solid, more like flying into increasingly thick syrup. The ship's velocity bleeding away as the gas giant's massive gravity well tried to pull us into an orbit we absolutely did not want. The sensors began to scream, red warning lights flashing across every console. The automated navigation system was trying to compensate, firing thrusters in rapid sequence to maintain our vector. But I could feel it, that subtle wrongness that came from letting our computers make decisions they weren't equipped to handle. The system was overcorrecting, trying to fight the gravity well with brute force instead of finesse. Gravitational shear is spiking, I shouted over the roar of the overstressed engines. The computer's trying to compensate, but it's overcorrecting. We're going to end up in a death spiral if I don't. Trust the vibration, Thaddeus. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear, despite the violent turbulence shaking the shuttle. Her hand reached out and rested on my shoulder, and even through the environmental suit I could feel the warmth of her touch. Don't look at the screen, she said. Fill the hull. The ship knows where the path of least resistance is. Your instruments are trying to impose order on chaos. But chaos has its own order. You just need to listen. It was insanity. It violated every protocol I'd ever learned, every principle of safe navigation that had been drilled into my head during a decade of training. The screens were there for a reason. The sensors existed because human perception was limited, flawed, inadequate for the complexity of spaceflight. But the screens were currently a blur of conflicting data. The sensors were being distorted by the gravitational shear and the ionized gas. And my brain, exhausted and terrified, was trying to process information faster than thought was possible. I closed my eyes. I took my hands off the primary navigation array and placed them directly on the flight stick, feeling the minute vibrations of the Scarab 7's superstructure transmitted through the control mechanism. At first, it was just noise, a cacophony of rattles and thrums that meant nothing. But then, as I forced my breathing to slow, as I stopped trying to think and just allowed myself to feel, patterns began to emerge. There, a sharp, high-pitched vibration coming from the forward right quadrant. That was the gravitational field compressing against a pocket of denser gas. I nudged the stick slightly left, and the vibration smoothed out. There, a deep, heavy thrumming through the deck plating beneath my boots. A gravitational eddy created by the interaction between the gas giant's field and a nearby cluster of asteroids. I pulled the nose up fractionally, and the thrumming diminished. It was messy. It was imprecise. It was the complete opposite of everything they'd taught me at the academy. But as I leaned into the noise, as I stopped trying to fight the chaos and just moved with it, the Scarab 7 began to fly like it had been designed for this exact environment. We slipped through the gravitational needle's eye, and suddenly the sensors stopped screaming. The red warning lights blinked off one by one. I opened my eyes and looked at the navigation display. We were exactly on course. Deviation 0.000%. That was unconventional, I said, my voice shaking slightly as adrenaline dumped into my bloodstream. That was honest, Lyra replied, and her skin was glowing a warm, approving amber. You stopped trying to be perfect and started being present. There is a profound difference between those two states, Thaddeus. Maybe, I said, though I could still feel the phantom weight of the colony transport sitting on my shoulders, the ghost of 200 lives that I'd nearly ended through my obsession with perfection. But we're not at XP4 yet. The difficult part is just beginning. We flew in silence for the next 3 hours, navigating through the thinning edges of the debris field as we approached the inner sun's corona. The temperature inside the shuttle began to climb despite the thermal shielding, and I could hear the hull plating groaning as it expanded and contracted under the thermal stress. And then we saw it. Asteroid XP4 hung in space like a jagged obsidian tooth, rotating with a violent, chaotic wobble. It was being literally torn apart by the competing gravitational forces of the sun and the gas giant, massive fissures opening and closing across its surface, plumes of superheated gas erupting from deep vents like miniature volcanoes. Look at the light, Lyra whispered, leaning forward in her seat. Deep within the fissures, visible even from this distance, was a pulsing, iridescent glow that seemed to defy the darkness of the stone. It shifted through colors that had no names in human language, something between violet and gold, between light and music made visible. The ethel glass, the impossible substance, the crystallized song of the universe. It's beautiful, I admitted, my skepticism momentarily silenced by the sheer alien wonder of what we were seeing. But it's also in the middle of a geological tantrum. Landing on that thing is going to be like trying to park a shuttle on a spinning saw blade that's also on fire. Then we must become the blade, Lyra said, her eyes fixed on the pulsing light with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. There was something in her expression that went beyond scientific interest, something personal, something desperate. We must find the rhythm of the stone and move with it. I'm more of a wallflower when it comes to dancing with planetary bodies, I said, gripping the flight stick hard enough that my knuckles went white. But I'll see what I can do. I began the descent, the Scarab 7's thrusters screaming as they fought against XP4's erratic gravity field. Every time I thought I had a stable approach vector, a massive plume of debris would erupt from the surface, forcing me to veer away and start the approach again. "Don't fight it, Thaddeus," Lyra said, and now her hand was resting on my forearm, a constant warm pressure that anchored me to something beyond the chaos of numbers and trajectories. "Listen to the asteroid. It is speaking. It has a rhythm. You simply need to hear it." I tried, I really did, but all I could hear was the roar of the engines and the ghost voices of 200 colonists and the sound of my own heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. "I can't find the entry point," I said through gritted teeth, my vision starting to blur at the edges from the stress and the G-forces. "There's too much interference, too many variables. If I miss the landing zone by even a meter, we're going to bounce off the hull and drift straight into the sun." "You will not miss," Lyra said, and suddenly she was leaning close enough that I could see the individual facets of her eyes, each one reflecting a slightly different aspect of the pulsing light from XP4. "I have been observing you for 6 weeks, Thaddeus Wright. You think your flaws make you weak. You think your mistakes define you." Her other hand came up to touch my face, her crystalline fingers warm against my cheek. "But I see a man who stays awake for 20 hours to check the work of junior engineers because he does not want them to experience the failure he endured. I see a man who carries the weight of others' burdens because he believes his own weight is too much. That is not weakness, Thaddeus. That is the deepest form of strength. That is resonance." She held my gaze, and in her eyes I saw absolute certainty, absolute trust, the kind of faith that I had stopped having in myself years ago. "Now fly us down." Something in her voice, that multi-tonal certainty mixed with what I could only describe as alien warmth, finally silenced the ghost voices. The colony transport faded, the decimal points disappeared. There was only the pulsing light in the stone and the light in her eyes and the trust that someone as brilliant as Lyra Stellaris believed I could do this. I didn't look at the sensors. I didn't think about the rounding errors or the failure rates or the 1,000 ways this could go catastrophically wrong. I just looked at the light and pushed the stick forward. The Scarab 7 dove into the obsidian canyon like a hawk stooping on prey. The walls rushed past us at a speed that would have been suicidal if I'd stopped to think about it. Warning alarms screamed. The whole temperature gauge redlined. Lyra's grip on my arm tightened. I felt a massive surge of gravitational force trying to crush us against the canyon wall. Instead of fighting it, I leaned into it, using the momentum to swing the shuttle around a jagged spire of volcanic glass. We came out of the turn inverted, and I rolled the shuttle as we dropped into the landing zone, the magnetic clamps extending with a mechanical whir. We hit the surface with a thud that I felt through my spine. The magnetic clamps engaged with a satisfying series of metallic clanks. The engines wound down from their emergency power setting to idle. Silence filled the cockpit, save for the ticking of cooling metal and the faint hum of life support systems. "We're down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're actually down." Lyra unbuckled her harness, her skin shimmering like 1,000 tiny stars catching light. She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but also something deeper. Something that looked like she was seeing me for the first time. "I told you," she said softly. "You are more than your numbers, Thaddeus Wright. I looked out at the pulsing ethyl glass just meters away from our landing site. It was a victory, certainly, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead. We had reached the heart of the mystery, but the heart was breaking, and we were the only ones there to catch the pieces. "Let's go get your glass, Lyra," I said, reaching for my helmet, "before this rock decides it's had enough of hosting visitors." The surface of XP4 was a nightmare rendered in obsidian and fire. Stepping out of the Scarab 7's airlock felt like stepping into the fever dream of a dying god. The gravity here was chaotic. One moment my mag boots were barely holding me to the surface. The next I felt like I weighed 500 kilograms. My environmental suit's external temperature gauge was already climbing into the danger zone. The radiant heat from the nearby sun turning the volcanic glass canyon into a natural kiln. The suit's cooling systems whined in protest, working overtime to keep me from cooking inside my own armor. "Keep your mag boots on maximum setting, Lyra," I said, my voice echoing strangely in the confines of my helmet. "One bad step, and you'll become a permanent satellite of this rock." "My resonance is calibrated to the lithospheric vibration," Lyra replied, and she was already several meters ahead of me, moving across the unstable surface with that haunting grace that made the chaotic gravity look like a minor inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. Her aural spires were angled forward, focused on the glowing fissures in the ground ahead of us. "The asteroid is agitated, Thaddeus. The proximity to the solar corona is causing the ethal glass to reach a state of hyperresonance. We must work quickly." I followed her, carrying the heavy extraction kit and the portable containment unit. The ground beneath us was a patchwork of razor-sharp volcanic glass and veins of shimmering, translucent material that seemed to flow like slow-moving liquid. The sound in my helmet changed as we approached the primary vein, a low, rhythmic thrumming that I could feel in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. "Is that the glass?" I asked, pausing at the edge of a deep crevice that glowed from within like a wound in the stone. "It is the song of the material," Lyra said, and her skin was beginning to mirror the iridescent pulse of the vein, her whole body synchronizing with the frequency of the ethyl glass. "This substance is not merely a mineral, Thaddeus. It is a biological record. It stores energy not in electrons or chemical bonds, but in harmonic resonance. It is memory made solid. It is music made matter." She knelt by the crevice and I saw her hands trembling, the first time I'd ever witnessed her display anything resembling physical uncertainty. Her crystalline fingers reached out slowly, hesitantly, until they made contact with the glowing substance. The moment her skin touched the ethyl glass, the light flared. A wave of brilliant violet washed over her environmental suit, and she let out a sound, a gasp that was also somehow a song, a cry of pain and wonder and overwhelming emotion compressed into a single multitonal utterance. "It is," she whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice even through the suit's communication system. "It is overwhelming. The data density is beyond anything my people have recorded. It is like trying to listen to 1,000 voices speaking at once, each one carrying the memories of generations." "Stay focused, Lyra," I said, setting down the extraction kit and beginning to assemble the containment field projectors. "We've got a window, remember? The sun is going to start belching solar flares in about 2 hours, and I would really prefer to be on the other side of the debris field when that happens. Don't get lost in the music." Lyra nodded, though her skin remained that deep, transparent violet, a color I'd learned indicated intense emotional processing. "You are correct. We must proceed with the extraction. I will initialize the resonance stabilizer. You must deploy the containment field projectors." I opened the kit and began assembling the field generators. It was delicate work, made exponentially harder by the fact that my hands were shaking and the ground was literally moving beneath my feet. I had to place 4 projectors in a perfect square round the ethol glass vein. If the alignment was off by more than 2 millimeters, the containment field would collapse, and the unstable glass would detonate with enough force to vaporize the canyon and everything in it. "Don't think about the transport," I told myself. "Don't think about the decimal points. Just line up the lasers. 1, 2, 3, 4. But even as I worked, I could feel it, that old familiar pressure building in my chest, the certainty that I was about to make a mistake, that my hands would slip, that I would measure incorrectly and doom us both. "Thaddeus," I looked up. Lyra was watching me, her faceted eyes somehow conveying concern, even through the reflective visor of her helmet. "You are calculating again," she said. "I could see it in the way you move. You are building mathematical models in your mind, trying to achieve perfect precision. Stop. Perfect precision is literally the job description right now, Lyra," I said, wiping condensation from the inside of my visor. "These projectors need to form an exact geometric square, or the field won't—" "The ground is moving," she interrupted. "The asteroid is shifting under thermal stress. If you try to build a perfect square on an imperfect surface, you will fail. You must build a square that moves with the stone." "A moving square," I scoffed, even as another tremor ran through the obsidian beneath us. "That's not how geometry works. Math is fixed. Math doesn't lie." "Mathematics is a language," Lyra said, her voice taking on that firm, patient quality I'd heard when she corrected my orbital calculations. "But sometimes you must speak in different dialects. Look at the shadows cast by the projectors. Feel the vibration through your boots. The projectors have internal gyroscopic stabilizers. Let them find the rhythm. Trust the machines to trust the rock." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the final activation switch. Every ounce of my training, every principle I'd built my career on, screamed at me to measure one more time, check one more calculation, verify one more variable. And then the ground beneath my boots gave a violent lurch. A plume of superheated gas erupted from a nearby vent, sending a shower of razor-sharp glass fragments rattling against my environmental suit. One piece scored a line across my visor, leaving a scratch that spider-webbed across my field of vision. "We are running out of time, Thaddeus," Lyra said quietly. I closed my eyes, took a breath of recycled air that tasted like fear and determination, and flipped the switch. The projectors hummed to life, blue targeting lasers snapping into position. They weren't a perfect square. The lasers were angled, shifting and dancing as the ground buckled and heaved beneath them. But as the containment field shimmered into existence, something impossible happened. The pulsing ethel glass settled. The erratic flickering became a steady, calm golden glow. The chaotic vibrations smoothed into a single pure harmonic frequency. "It worked," I breathed, a wave of relief so powerful washing over me that I nearly collapsed. The moving square actually worked. "Nature rarely moves in straight lines," Lyra said, and through her helmet I could see that her skin had shifted back to its calm quartz gray. "It is only humans who insist on imposing rigid geometry on fluid reality." She began the extraction process using a high-frequency sonic cutter to delicately separate a large chunk of the ethel glass from the surrounding vein. It was like watching a master surgeon work on a living heart. Every pass of the cutting beam produced a haunting, crystalline shriek that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. "You are doing beautifully," I said, monitoring the containment field's integrity on my portable display. "Keep it steady. We are at 60% extraction completion. Just a little more and—" "Something is wrong," Lyra said suddenly, her oral spire snapping backward in what I'd learned was alarm. "What?" "The field is holding at 95%. All systems are—" "Not the field, the resonance." She looked up at the sun, which was now a bloated, terrifying presence, hanging over the canyon walls like a malevolent eye. "The solar activity is increasing faster than the projection models predicted. The asteroid, it is beginning to fracture from the inside." As if the universe had been waiting for her to say those words, a deep, guttural groan echoed through the stone. A massive crack opened up just meters from where the Scarab 7 sat, the fissure swallowing one of our landing struts. The shuttle tilted dangerously, held in place only by the remaining magnetic clamps. "The ship!" I yelled, scrambling toward the Scarab 7. "Lyra, get the sample and move now!" But Lyra didn't move. She was staring at the ethel glass, which was now pulsing with a frantic red light, the frequency shifting into something chaotic and dangerous. "I cannot stop the extraction," she said, and I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before. Desperation, raw, undisguised terror. "If I break the connection now, the glass will destabilize. It is mid-transition. If the process is interrupted, the harmonic cascade will cause a detonation that will vaporize everything within a kilometer radius." I reached her and grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the crevice. "If you don't move, you're going to be part of the detonation." "Lyra, we need to—" She turned to me, and for the first time I saw true primal fear in those faceted eyes. Thaddeus, I have to save it. My people. Her voice broke. Our homeworld is dying. Our resonance is fading. The ethel glass is not just a power source. It is a biological template, a crystallized record of our civilization's harmonic signature. We need this to survive. Another violent heave shook the ground. A wall of obsidian collapsed behind us, blocking our path back to the shuttle. The temperature was becoming unbearable, my suit's cooling system flashing critical warnings as it struggled to keep me from being cooked alive. If I fail here, Lyra continued, and now I could see tears streaming down her face inside her helmet, mixing with the reflected light of the dying ethel glass. I am not failing a mission. I am failing my ancestors. I am failing 8.2 billion souls. I am failing everyone who believed that someone like me, someone flawed, someone broken, could somehow be enough to save them. The weight of those words hit me like a physical force. 8 billion lives, an entire civilization balanced on the edge of extinction. And the only thing standing between survival and oblivion was a woman my people had sent on what they considered a suicide mission because they deemed her insufficiently perfect. Lyra, I said, gripping her shoulders hard enough that I could feel the flexible plates of her suit compress under my gloves. Listen to me. I know what it is like to carry the weight of your entire people. I know what it is like to be terrified of making the mistake that ends everything. The ground gave another violent shudder, and I heard the Scarab 7's hull groan as more of the landing zone collapsed. We were running out of time. We were running out of options. We were running out of everything except the truth. But you cannot save them if you are dead, I said, forcing her to meet my eyes. And you cannot save them by being perfect. Perfection is what got me exiled to the fringe. Perfection is what turned me into a ghost, haunting the edges of known space. You save them by surviving. You save them by being brave enough to accept that sometimes good enough has to be enough. She looked at the glass, then back at me. Her skin was a chaotic swirl of colors, grief and fear and desperate hope, all fighting for dominance. The calculation, she whispered. The transition period requires precise. Forget the period, I said. I am the navigator, remember? I am the man who sees paths where others see walls. There is a path here, Lyra, but it is not in any book. Pull the cutter. I will stabilize the containment field manually while we run. We are going to grab this impossible substance, and we are going to sprint for that shuttle like our lives depend on it, because they absolutely do. That is suicide, she said. The field will destabilize. The energy release will. I am a pilot, I said. We live for unstable situations. Now pull the damn cutter before this entire canyon becomes our tomb. I did not give her time to argue. I grabbed the portable containment unit and jammed it against the ethel glass, forcing the partially extracted sample into the chamber even though it was still mid-process. The unit screamed, every alarm simultaneously triggering as the energy levels spiked into critical territory. I grabbed Lyra's hand and started running. Behind us, the ground literally disintegrated, falling away into molten chaos. Ahead, the Scarab 7 tilted at an increasingly dangerous angle, held in place by magnetic clamps that were never designed for this kind of stress. "Jump!" I yelled as we reached the airlock. We tumbled into the shuttle just as a massive pillar of obsidian erupted from where we had been standing seconds before. I slammed the airlock shut and scrambled into the pilot's seat, not even bothering to secure my harness. "The ship is trapped," Lyra cried, her oral spires vibrating frantically. "The landing strut is wedged in the fissure. The magnetic clamps cannot generate enough force to—" "Then we leave the strut behind," I said, gripping the flight stick with both hands and slamming the thrusters to maximum emergency power. The Scarab 7 groaned, a sound like a living thing in agony, as the engines fought against the combined force of the asteroid's gravity and the wedged landing gear. The hull plating screamed. Warning lights flashed across every console. For a terrible moment, I thought we were finished, that the ghost had finally caught up to me, and this time there would be no walking away. "Thaddeus!" Lyra pointed at the containment unit, which was vibrating so violently it was sliding across the deck plating. "The resonance, the glass is reacting to the ship's engine frequency. It is creating harmonic interference. Can you fix it?" "I can synchronize the frequencies," she said, already scrambling to the engineering console. If I match the engine output to the glass's natural harmonic, we can use its energy to amplify the thrusters. But it will be. Do it, I said. We are about to be swallowed by a solar flare anyway. Might as well go out trying something impossible. Her fingers moved in a blur across the controls, making adjustments faster than I could follow. And then suddenly the Scarab 7 stopped shaking. The dull roar of the engines transformed into a high-pitched crystalline hum. The entire shuttle began to glow with a brilliant iridescent light, the energy of the aethal glass flowing through our systems like liquid music. The wedged landing strut snapped like a dry twig, and we shot into space like a bullet made of pure light. We cleared XP4's gravity well just as the solar flare hit. I looked back once and saw the obsidian asteroid vaporize in a cloud of superheated plasma and pulverized rock. The place where we had been standing, where we had nearly died, simply ceased to exist. I pushed the Scarab 7 hard, weaving through the debris field with a fluidity I had never known before. I did not look at the screens. I did not check the decimal points. I just flew. Guided by the hum of the aethal glass and the warmth of Lyra's presence, and the absolute certainty that sometimes you had to trust the resonance more than the math. 20 minutes later, we were in the clear, drifting in the cool silence of the outer expanse. The Prometheus dawn was a distant, welcoming spark on the horizon. I slumped back in my seat, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. I looked over at Lyra. She was sitting on the floor next to the containment unit, her hand resting on the glowing glass. Her skin was a soft, exhausted blue. "We made it," I said, my voice hoarse. "We made it," she repeated. And then she looked up at me with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made my chest ache. "You saved my life, Thaddeus, and you saved the hope of my people. Even with your ghosts and your shaking hands and your fear of decimal points, you did what no one else could have done." I looked at my hands. They were still shaking, trembling with the after effects of terror and triumph. But for the first time in 8 years, I did not hate them for their imperfection. They were the hands that had flown us home. The celebration in the mess hall of the Prometheus dawn was loud, raucous, and entirely too optimistic for a crew that had just witnessed 2 of their people nearly get vaporized by a dying star. There were bottles of synthetic whiskey that tasted like industrial solvent mixed with regret, and enough pressurized laughter to suggest everyone was trying very hard not to think about how close we'd come to losing the ship's best scientist and most damaged navigator. I sat in a corner booth, my boots propped up on a crate of spare atmospheric filters, watching the dust kickers and grease monkeys exchange increasingly embellished versions of what they thought had happened out there. Each retelling made the asteroid bigger, the solar flare closer, our escape more miraculous. "You're a legitimate legend now, right?" said Marcus Torres, the ship's systems engineer, slapping a heavy hand on my shoulder hard enough to make me wince. "Coming back with a haul like that, missing a whole landing strut, the shuttle glowing like a damn Christmas ornament. Chen owes me 50 credits. I told her you'd either flatline spectacular or come back a hero. No middle ground for a guy like you." "I'm just glad we didn't scuttle the drive core," I said, offering a tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "And it's Thaddeus. Nobody gets to call me a legend unless they've personally scraped me off the inside of a crashed shuttle." "Fair enough, Captain," Torres grinned, taking a long pull from his drink. "But seriously, word is already spreading through the network. Union's going to be all over this. Ethel Glass isn't just a payday. It's a paradigm shift for the whole sector. You're going to be swimming in job offers. Golden boy of deep space extraction." I watched him walk away, feeling that familiar cold weight settle in my stomach. The Golden Boy label felt like a suit tailored for someone else, someone who hadn't spent the last 8 years hiding from his own reflection. I looked across the crowded mess hall and found Lyra. She was surrounded by several junior scientists, their faces animated with questions and enthusiasm. Her oral spires were angled in that polite, receptive position that meant she was listening, but her skin was a dull, opaque gray. The color I'd learned meant she was barely holding herself together, screaming in frequencies no one else in the room could hear. Our eyes met across the chaos, and she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. 5 minutes later, I slipped out of the mess hall and made my way to the one place on the Prometheus dawn where silence still meant something. The secondary hydroponics bay was off the main quarters, a forgotten green space where genetically modified ferns and moss provided supplementary oxygen recycling. The air here smelled of damp soil and growing things, a sharp contrast to the metallic sterility of the rest of the ship. The UV growth lamps cast everything in a soft, almost dreamlike green light. Lyra was already there, standing beside a row of ferns that reached nearly to the ceiling. In the gentle illumination, she looked fragile, a word I never thought I'd associate with a being made of living crystal and light. "You left the party early," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "The resonance of this crew is difficult to process," she replied, her multitonal voice sounding like a cracked bell, missing some essential harmonic. "There is so much greed, so much expectation. They see the ethel glass as numbers on a ledger, as currency to be traded. They do not hear what it is saying." I moved closer, noticing that the semi-translucent lattice of her skin was flickering irregularly like a light struggling against a failing power source. "What is it saying, Lyra, and why do I get the feeling you're about to tell me something that's going to make my life significantly more complicated?" Lyra turned to face me, and I saw her hand trembling as she reached up to touch the collar of her environmental suit, now replaced with her standard jumpsuit, but the gesture remained. In my culture, transparency is everything. To be opaque is to be untrustworthy, to hide truth behind walls of distorted light. But I have been carrying the secret that has made me a shadow among my own people. She took a breath, a very human gesture that I'd noticed she only made when under extreme stress. "I told you that I have a rare condition, that my skin does not crystallize properly. That is true, but I did not tell you why I was sent on this mission. I was not chosen for my expertise, Thaddeus. I was sent because I was considered expendable." The word hit me like a physical blow. "Expendable? You're the most brilliant person I've ever worked with. You see patterns in chaos that—" "I am flawed," she interrupted, and now her skin was shifting to that deep, transparent violet, the color of profound emotional pain. In Crystallian culture, physical perfection is not merely aesthetic. It is a measure of one's harmonic alignment with the universe. A being whose crystallization is imperfect is considered to be in fundamental dissonance with reality itself. "I am, by the standards of my people, broken." She walked to the glass partition that separated the hydroponics bay from the corridor beyond, her reflection staring back at her in the transparent surface. The Crystallian High Council did not send me to find the ethel glass because they believed I would succeed. They sent me because my failure would be acceptable, a flawed vessel undertaking an impossible task. When I did not return, they could mourn appropriately without the loss being truly felt. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and immediate. "That's, Lyra, that's monstrous. You're not expendable. Not to me, and not to the 8 billion people whose lives depend on what we found today." "Listen to me, Thaddeus," she said, turning back to face me, her eyes fracturing with sudden, intense light. "The ethel glass we recovered is not merely a power source or a scientific curiosity. It is a biological memory core. It contains the encoded essence of what we call the Great Resonance, the fundamental harmonic frequency that maintains the structural integrity of my homeworld." She moved closer, and I could see the desperation in every facet of her eyes. "Our sun is not failing in the way human stars fail. It is not running out of hydrogen or collapsing under gravitational pressure. It is losing its song. The harmonic frequencies that our civilization evolved alongside, that our biology requires for proper cellular function, they are fading. Without the Great Resonance, the Crystallian homeworld will not explode or freeze. It will simply stop. Every Crystallian will slowly lose cohesion, our crystalline structures degrading into inert mineral. We have 9 years and 4 months before complete civilizational collapse." I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't about energy production or scientific advancement. This was a lifeboat for an entire species. "So when you said this mission was important, I meant that if I fail, 8.2 billion souls will dissolve into dust," she said quietly. "But there is more, Thaddeus. The Synaptic Union knows this. They do not want to use the ethel glass for energy generation. They want to weaponize the resonance technology." She pulled up a holographic display from her personal data unit, showing me classified Union documents that she absolutely should not have had access to. military schematics, weapons development proposals, theoretical models for resonance weapons that could destabilize the crystalline structures of ships, stations, even planetary crusts. If I hand this glass over to the Union's retrieval team, Lyra continued, her voice steady despite the tears I could see forming in her eyes, I am handing them the key to genocide, not just of my people, but of any species with silicon-based biology. Dozens of civilizations across multiple sectors. But if I refuse, if we attempt to keep it, I am branded a traitor to the Union Charter. And you, Thaddeus Wright, become my accomplice in what they will call the theft of humanity's greatest scientific discovery. I took a step back, my mind racing through scenarios and consequences. This was the moment where, in the stories I'd consumed as a kid, the hero makes a grand speech about justice and doing the right thing. But I wasn't a hero. I was a washed-up navigator who'd once miscalculated a decimal point and ruined a 100 million credit vessel. I was a man who valued the safety of predictable outcomes above all else. Lyra, I said slowly, if we attempt to run with that glass, if we try to disappear into the fringe or make a break for crystalline space, the Union will hunt us across every charted sector in the galaxy. They have ships that can outrun the Prometheus dawn before we even clear the system's heliopause. We're talking about life sentences in a lunar correctional facility. Or worse, summary execution for theft of strategic materials. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of 8 years of careful survival threatening to collapse. You're asking me to throw away everything. My freedom, my future, whatever slim chance I have at rebuilding a life, for a race of people I've never met, using technology I barely understand, against an organization with effectively unlimited resources. I'm asking you to do what is right, Lyra said, and her oral spires were vibrating with that desperate low hum that I felt in my bones. Not what is safe, not what is calculated to provide optimal personal outcomes. I am asking you to choose truth over comfort, principle over survival. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the individual crystalline structures in her skin, each one catching the green light of the hydroponics lamps. You told me that you admire my honesty. You said you were tired of the lies and the careful social calculations. Well, this is honesty, Thaddeus. This is the truth in its messiest, most dangerous, most irrational form. This is everything you said you wanted to embrace. I looked at her, seeing the way her skin pulsed with that rose-colored light I'd learned meant affection, hope, desperate faith in the possibility of human decency. She was offering me a choice between the perfect, calculated safety of my carefully controlled exome and the chaotic, honest disaster of a future where I actually stood for something. Why didn't you tell me this before we went down to X before? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Because I was afraid, she admitted, her skin becoming so transparent I could see the shimmering network of her internal crystalline structure, the biological equivalent of being completely exposed. I was afraid that if you knew the true cost, you would calculate the risk-to-reward ratio and determine that I was not worth the price. I am a scientist, Thaddeus. I know how humans assign value. I know how resources are allocated based on expected return on investment. I did not think I would be sufficient to tip your internal scales toward the irrational choice. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool glass of a hydroponic tank. The ghosts of my past were screaming at me. Safety first, Thaddeus. Trust the numbers. Ausstein, don't deviate from established protocols. The colony transport disaster happened because you stopped following the rules. If you do this, if you help her, you will lose everything again. But then I remembered the way the Scarab 7 had felt when I'd stopped flying by instruments and started flying by feel. I remembered the way Lyra had looked at me and said I was more than my numbers. I remembered that for the first time in 8 years, I had felt like something other than a ghost, haunting the edges of human space. You're a real piece of work, you know that? I said, opening my eyes to find her watching me with an expression of fragile hope. You wait until we're 3 days from Union Rendezvous to drop a bombshell that could get us both executed for treason. My mother always told me I had a talent for selecting the most difficult possible path, Lyra said, and I heard the ghost of humor in her multitonal voice. Does this mean you will help me? I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the alien beauty and the scientific brilliance to the terrified woman underneath. A queen in exile sent on a suicide mission by her own people because they decided she wasn't perfect enough to deserve survival. It means I'm an idiot, I said, reaching out to take her hand. Her crystalline fingers were cool against my skin, but the resonance underneath was burning with desperate hope. What's the plan? And please don't tell me it involves more flying into solar flares because I'm fresh out of landing struts. Lyra let out a small, shaky laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. No more solar interactions. But we will need to bypass the ship's internal security scanners and create a decoy signature. And we need to accomplish this before the Union retrieval vessel arrives. The Vigilant is currently 6 hours away. 6 hours, I muttered, checking the chronometer on my wrist. Plenty of time for a comprehensive nervous breakdown followed by some light treason. You do not have time for psychological collapse, Thaddeus Wright, Lyra said, stepping close enough that our foreheads nearly touched. You only have time to be magnificent. I'm working on it, I whispered, but if we don't make it, I'm going to be extremely annoyed that our first actual date was on a dying asteroid. We stood there for a heartbeat, two fundamentally flawed beings trying to build a bridge between survival and principle, between what was safe and what was right. I knew then that the mission had changed. This wasn't about mineral extraction or career redemption anymore. This was about whether I could finally trust myself enough to fail for the right reasons. The Vigilant didn't arrive in 6 hours. It arrived in 4. I was in the middle of rewiring the Scarab 7 sensor array to create a false positive signature when the ship-wide alarm began to wail. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a standard mineral alert or the steady tone of a scheduled drill. It was the sharp, panicked shriek of a high-priority intercept, the kind of sound that meant someone very dangerous was very close and very interested in what you were doing. Right, get to the bridge now. Captain Helen Blackwood's voice crackled over the communication system, clipped and professional, but with an undercurrent of barely controlled tension. Union sent a heavy cruiser. They're not waiting for standard docking procedures. They're boarding us. I looked at Lyra, who was holding the ethyl glass containment unit under her arm. The substance inside was pulsing with an agitated red light, responding to her elevated stress levels. Her skin was a frantic, flickering violet, cycling through colors faster than I'd ever seen. Hide it in the shuttle's environmental recycling system, I said quickly. The Scarab 7's hull is reinforced enough to muffle the resonance signature for at least 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if we're lucky. Thaddeus, be careful, she said, her oral spires flattening against her head in fear. The commander of the Vigilant is a man named Garrison Vale. Intelligence reports indicate he is not known for patience or diplomatic subtlety. He is known for results, regardless of cost. I've dealt with bureaucratic, hard cases before, I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest cavity. Just stay hidden and don't let your skin start glowing like a distress beacon. We can't have you lighting up like a festival display at the worst possible moment. I sprinted toward the bridge, my boots echoing on the metal grating. The atmosphere on the ship had shifted from celebratory to oppressive in the space of minutes. Crew members scrambled through corridors with pale faces and wide eyes. They knew what a Union heavy cruiser meant. It meant audits. It meant questions. It meant the end of the comfortable anonymity we'd all been enjoying in the fringe. When I reached the bridge, the view through the primary viewport was dominated by the Vigilant. It was a masterpiece of intimidation, a sleek black predator draped in weapons arrays and sensor equipment, all sharp angles and aggressive geometry. It made the Prometheus Dawn look like a floating recycling bin held together with optimism and expired hull sealant. A man was already standing in the center of our bridge, flanked by 2 armored Union security officers. He was tall, maybe 6'3", dressed in a charcoal gray uniform so crisp it looked like it had never encountered something as mundane as a wrinkle or a coffee stain. His eyes were a cold, calculating blue, the color of deep ice, and his face was a mask of professional indifference that probably played hell in poker games. "Commander Vale," Captain Blackwood was saying, her voice strained in the way it got when she was dealing with people who outranked her, but whom she fundamentally didn't trust. We weren't expecting a boarding party until we reached the inter-system transfer station. Our manifest transmission indicated, "Plans change, Captain," Vale interrupted. his voice sharp and precise as a laser scalpel. The significance of your discovery has necessitated a more proactive approach. I am here to secure the ethyl glass sample and oversee the immediate transfer of the primary researcher to Union custody for debriefing and analysis. I stepped onto the bridge, trying to project the energy of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from cooperation. Welcome aboard, Commander. I'm Captain Thaddeus Wright, lead navigator. I assume you're here for the comprehensive tour and detailed mission debrief? Vale turned his gaze toward me, and I felt like I was being analyzed by a very sophisticated and completely unsympathetic scanning system. Captain Wright, I've reviewed your service record. Interesting reading, promising academy career, followed by the Luna Colony transport incident, followed by a decade of deliberate obscurity in the most remote sectors of human space. It seems you've finally found your way back to relevance through an unexpected discovery. Luck of the draw, Commander, I said, leaning against a console with what I hoped looked like casual confidence rather than the desperate need for physical support. Sometimes you just have to follow the right trajectories and hope the universe cooperates. Indeed, Vale said, his expression never shifting from that professional neutrality. And where is Dr. Stellaris? I believe that is the Crystallion's designation. I need to speak with her immediately regarding extraction protocols and material analysis. She's in Lab 3 finishing the final stabilization protocols. I lied, keeping my voice steady despite the sweat beginning to trickle down my spine. The ethyl glass is extremely volatile. You can't just throw it in a standard containment unit and haul it onto a cruiser. If the resonance frequency drops below 40 Hz, the entire sample goes dark side. Detonation yields comparable to a small fusion device. Vale's eyes narrowed fractionally. My engineers are quite capable of handling volatile materials, Captain Wright. I did not bring a skeleton crew. He gestured to his security officers. Proceed to Laboratory 3. Secure the sample and the researcher. Use appropriate caution, but do not delay. Wait, I said, stepping into their path with what was probably suicidal boldness. Lab 3 is environmentally sealed for volatile material handling. If you breach the airlock without proper decompression protocols, you'll trigger automatic containment fail-safes. You want that glass intact, don't you? Give me 10 minutes to complete the stabilization cycle, and I'll personally hand everything over with full technical documentation. Vale paused, his expression unreadable. I could feel the weight of his analysis, the calculations running behind those ice-blue eyes. He was trying to determine if I was legitimately concerned about proper protocols, or if I was stalling for reasons I shouldn't have. You seem very protective of our asset, Navigator, Vale said slowly. One might almost think you have personal investment beyond professional duty. I'm protective of my survival bonus, I said, using the kind of crude mercenary language I knew he'd expect from a fringe operator. I didn't risk my neck on a dying asteroid just to watch some union contractor blow it up because he couldn't wait 10 minutes for a proper handoff sequence. Give me time to finish the cycle safely, and I'll give you everything you want with a bow on top. Vale looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. I could feel the ghosts of my past whispering in my ear. He knows you're lying. You're trying to round the truth again, Thaddeus. You're going to get caught, and this time there won't be a quiet resignation and a one-way ticket to the fringe. This time it's a cell or a bullet. 10 minutes, Vale said finally. My officers will accompany you. If you so much as deviate from direct route to Laboratory 3, if you touch any console that isn't directly related to sample stabilization, I will have you cold ironed before you can formulate an excuse. Are we clear, Captain Wright? Crystal clear, Commander. I walked toward the corridor with Vale's security officers flanking me, their hands resting on sidearms with the casual readiness of people who'd shot their way through problems before and would happily do so again. My mind was racing through scenarios and calculations, trying to find a path through chaos that didn't end with Lyra in custody and me in a cell. As we stepped into the corridor, I saw it, a faint flicker of golden light from the environmental ventilation system, a pulsing glow that was almost imperceptible unless you knew what you were looking for. The ethyl glass was reacting to the Vigilance active sensor sweeps, its resonance signature bleeding through the Scarab 7's hull shielding. It was singing. "What is that sound?" one of the security officers asked, his hand moving reflexively to his weapon. "That's not standard ship systems." Just the atmospheric scrubbers cycling, I said quickly, my voice climbing an octave despite my best efforts. The Prometheus Dawn is an old vessel. She makes a lot of unusual noises. Groans, hisses, occasionally sounds like she's singing opera. It's all perfectly normal for a ship held together with recycled parts and prayers. That is not atmospheric recycling, the officer said, stepping toward a ventilation grate. That's a resonance signature. That's a... He reached up and ripped the vent cover off with his prosthetic hand. Inside, barely concealed, was the edge of the containment unit. It was glowing with a rhythmic, pulsing light that filled the corridor with golden radiance. The resonance was so strong it was making the metal walls vibrate, a deep, harmonic thrumming that I could feel in my teeth. "Navigator," the officer growled, turning his weapon toward me. "Explain this. Now." Before I could say a word, before I could fabricate some desperate lie or attempt some futile defensive maneuver, a blur of silver and violet hit the security officer from above. Lyra had been waiting in the overhead maintenance crawlspace, and she dropped onto the man with the kind of speed and precision that made it clear Crystallians weren't just scientists and philosophers. Her skin had shifted to a brilliant, jagged diamond white, hard as industrial ceramic. She moved with a fluidity that was impossible to track, her hands glowing with some kind of bioelectric discharge that I'd never seen her use before. "Run, Thaddeus," she yelled, her multi-tonal voice shifting into something that was almost a roar, a harmonic that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest cavity. The second security officer raised his rifle, but I didn't think. I didn't calculate optimal responses or consider long-term consequences. I just grabbed the nearest object, a heavy maintenance toolbox, and threw it at his head with every ounce of strength I possessed. The toolbox connected with his helmet with a dull clang, and I followed it with a tackle that sent both of us crashing into the corridor wall, hard enough to dent the metal plating. "The shuttle," I shouted, scrambling to my feet and grabbing the containment unit from the ventilation shaft. "Lyra, we need to move now!" We sprinted toward the hangar room, the sound of boots and alarms echoing through the corridors behind us. I could hear Vale's voice over the ship's communication system, cold and clipped. "All security personnel, seal hangar bay access. Fugitives are attempting to flee with strategic materials. Use of lethal force is authorized." We reached the Scarab 7 just as the massive hangar bay doors began their ponderous cycling sequence, the heavy blast shields sliding closed with mechanical inevitability. The shuttle was where we'd left it, still missing one landing strut, still bearing the scorch marks from our escape from XP4. "Get in!" I pushed Lara toward the airlock and scrambled into the cockpit. My hands flew over the controls, initiating emergency launch protocols that bypassed approximately 40 safety interlocks and voided the warranty on every major system. "Thaddeus, we cannot clear the doors," Lyra cried from the co-pilot's seat, her auroral spires vibrating frantically as she watched the closing blast shields. "The gap is narrowing too rapidly. We need another 30 seconds and we only have 15. "Watch me," I said, slamming the thrusters to emergency overload. The Scarab 7 shot forward like a missile launched from a railgun. I didn't aim for the center of the narrowing gap. I banked the shuttle 45 degrees, presenting our narrowest profile to the closing doors, and pushed the engines past their rated maximum output. We cleared the Prometheus Dawn with the blast shields scraping both sides of our hull, throwing sparks that lit up the void like a fireworks display designed by someone with a vendetta against safety regulations. Proximity alarms screamed. Hull integrity warnings flashed, and then we were through, tumbling into open space as the Vigilance targeting systems locked onto us. "Engage the resonance drive," I yelled, fighting to stabilize our chaotic trajectory. "I cannot!" Lyra shouted back, her hands flying over the engineering console. "The ethel glass is too unstable. It is reacting to the Vigilance active targeting lasers. If I engage the drive now, the harmonic interference will tear the shuttle apart from the inside." "Then we fly," I said, gripping the flight stick and banking hard as a railgun slug the size of a small car went whistling past our cockpit close enough that I could see the scoring on its surface. I looked at the navigation display, and my heart sank. We were surrounded by the debris field of the Caladrius expanse, but between us and any kind of safe hiding place was a maze of obstacles that would challenge a pilot in peak condition with a fully functional ship. I was exhausted, traumatized. flying a damaged shuttle while being hunted by a military vessel that outgunned us by approximately 10,000 to 1. There was no clear path, no safe vector, no calculation that ended with both of us alive. There was only the noise. Lyra, I said, my voice suddenly calm despite the chaos erupting around us. I need you to do that thing again. The thing you did at XP4. What thing? Tell me where the music is, I said, closing my eyes even as another railgun round turned a nearby asteroid into expanding debris. Don't give me coordinates or vectors. Give me the rhythm. Give me the song. I felt her hand rest on mine, her skin no longer cool but burning with fierce, desperate warmth. Follow the low-frequency thrumming of the methane clouds, she whispered, her voice dropping into those harmonic frequencies that bypassed thought and spoke directly to something deeper. Avoid the sharp staccato patterns of the iron-rich asteroids. Move with the pulse of the distant sun. Do not fight the chaos, Thaddeus. Dance with it. I pushed the throttle forward, and the Vigilant followed, a predator in the dark, relentless and patient, and absolutely certain of its superiority. But as I dove the Scarab 7 into the swirling violet mists of the expanse, I realized something that Vale, with all his tactical training and military precision, couldn't understand. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was a man who had finally stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be true. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going. Hang on, Lyra, I said, and I felt a grin breaking across my face. Wild and probably slightly unhinged. It's about to get very, very loud. The Scarab 7 screamed through the Caladrius expanse like a comet with a death wish. And behind us, Commander Garrison Vale learned what it meant to chase someone who had finally stopped running from themselves. I didn't look at the navigation displays. The sensors were useless in the thick methane clouds anyway, their readings distorted by ionized particles and gravitational eddies. Instead, I flew by the song Lyra was singing, not with her voice, but with her presence, her hand on mine, transmitting frequencies I felt in my bones. Sharp signature port side, she murmured, her multi-tonal voice calm despite the chaos. Iron-rich cluster. Avoid. I banked starboard, and a massive asteroid tumbled through the space we'd occupied a heartbeat before. The Vigilance targeting computer tried to track us, fired a railgun slug that struck the asteroid instead, shattering it into 1,000 deadly fragments. Methane pocket ahead, Lyra continued. Low frequency, soft, we can hide in it. I dove into the violet cloud, and the Scarab 7 disappeared into the luminous mist like a fish slipping into deep water. The Vigilance sensors would be completely blind in here. We had maybe 30 seconds before they recalibrated. How far to somewhere they can't follow? I asked. Lyra's skin flickered through rapid calculations, colors shifting like a living computer. 2 kilometers northeast. Siren's Reef. The crystal formation I mentioned before. If we can reach the interior, the harmonic interference will mask our signature completely. What's the catch? The entrance aperture is 30 meters wide. We are 24 meters at our widest point. I felt my stomach drop. That's a 6-meter margin total. 3 meters on each side. In normal circumstances, that's tight, but doable. These are not normal circumstances, Lyra said quietly. The Vigilance last ion cannon burst damaged our stabilization gyros. We are rotating approximately 3 degrees per second and accelerating. I looked at the attitude indicator. She was right. The shuttle was spinning, slowly but inexorably like a bullet tumbling through the air. In about 2 minutes, the rotation would be fast enough to make controlled flight impossible. Can you fix it? Not in time. A railgun round punched through the methane cloud, missing us by less than 50 meters. Vale was firing blind, saturation patterns, hoping to get lucky. The next volley would be closer. Lyra, I said, my voice steady despite the terror singing in my veins. I need you to listen very carefully. I'm going to ask you to do something, and I need you to trust me the way I trusted you on XP4. Her faceted eyes met mine, and I saw understanding there, and fear. You are going to thread the aperture while spinning. The math says it's impossible, I said, which means it's exactly the kind of thing we've been doing all day. Thaddeus, if you miscalculate by even half a meter, then we die doing something impossible instead of something inevitable, I interrupted. The Vigilant is faster than us, better armed. If we try to run, they'll hunt us down in open space and vaporize us. The reef is our only chance. I could see her processing, her skin cycling through colors, violet for fear, amber for calculation, and finally settling on that rose gold that meant trust. "Tell me what you need," she said. "I need you to do what you do best. Observe. Calculate the rotation rate. When I start the approach, you tell me exactly when to fire the thrusters to slip through the gap. We get one shot at this." "One shot," she repeated, "at 3,000 kilometers per hour, while tumbling." "While tumbling," I confirmed. "Just like dancing, we just need to find the rhythm." Another barrage of railgun fire turned the methane cloud into a temporary constellation of explosions. Debris rattled against our hull. We were out of time. "Siren's Reef," I said. "Show me." Lyra pulled up the navigational overlay, and there it was, a massive formation of crystalline structures rising from the debris field like a cathedral made of frozen light. The entrance was a narrow gap between two towering spires, barely visible through the swirling gas. It looked impossible. It looked suicidal. It looked exactly right. "Engaging full thrust," I said, and slammed the throttle forward. The Scarab 7 shot out of the methane cloud like a missile, heading straight for the reef. Behind us, the Vigilant sensor arrays locked on immediately. I heard the targeting alarms scream as their weapon systems achieved firing solutions. "Ion cannon charging," Lyra reported, her voice tight. 8 seconds to discharge." The world outside the viewport became a blur of violet gas and spinning stars. The rotation was getting worse, the shuttle tumbling faster as our damaged gyros failed completely. I could feel the centrifugal force pushing me against the restraints. 6 seconds. The crystal spires of Siren's Reef grew larger, impossibly fast. I could see the entrance now, that narrow gap that was simultaneously our salvation and our probable grave. The shuttle was rotating, the gap appearing and disappearing from view as we spun. 4 seconds. "Lyra," I said, my hands locked on the flight controls. "I need you to tell me something true, right now, before we do this." "Thaddeus, this is not the time." "Tell me," I insisted, "because if we die in the next 30 seconds, I want to die knowing something real." Her skin flashed brilliant gold, and I felt her hand grip mine with desperate strength. "I was not sent here just because I am flawed," she said, her voice breaking. "I volunteered. I begged the council to let me come, because I could not watch my people die while I stood safe and useless. I chose this mission, Thaddeus. I chose the impossible task, just like you are choosing it now." 2 seconds. The ion cannon fired, a lance of searing blue energy that turned the space behind us into plasma. The blast wave caught our stern, and the shuttle's rotation accelerated violently. "We're spinning too fast," Lyra shouted. 7 degrees per second and increasing." The entrance to Siren's Reef filled our viewport, then spun away, then returned. Entrance, stars, reef wall, stars, entrance. The world was a kaleidoscope of deadly geometry. "Calculate," I yelled. "Tell me when." I could see her skin blazing with bioluminescent patterns, her entire body becoming a living computer. Her oral spires vibrated so fast they were nearly invisible. "Rotation rate 7.3 degrees per second, she said, her voice shifting into pure mathematical precision. "Current trajectory will impact left spire in 4.2 seconds. Window for thrust correction is 0.6 seconds wide. I will count down. On my mark, fire port thrusters maximum for 0.2 seconds, then full main engine burn." "I'm ready." 3 seconds. I watched the entrance spin into view. Too early. I'd hit the right spire. 2 seconds. It spun away. Stars, violet gas, the crystal wall rushing toward us. 1 second. The entrance appeared again, perfectly aligned with our trajectory for a fraction of a heartbeat. "Mark!" I fired the port thrusters. The shuttle jerked sideways, the rotation continuing, but our trajectory shifting. I slammed the main engines to emergency power. The Scarab 7 shot through the entrance doing 3,000 kilometers per hour while rotating like a drill bit. I saw crystal walls flash past us with less than a meter of clearance on each side. The sound was apocalyptic, a shriek of stressed metal and screaming air molecules that felt like it was tearing my skull apart. And then silence. We were through. I cut the engines and let momentum carry us forward into the vast hollow interior of Siren's Reef. It was a cathedral of light, millions of crystals floating in zero gravity, each one singing its own harmonic frequency. The combined resonance was so pure, so perfect, that I could feel it washing away the fear and adrenaline, replacing it with something close to peace. The shuttle's rotation slowly damped as we drifted into the center of the space. Outside, I could see the entrance we just threaded, impossibly narrow from this perspective. Beyond it, the Vigilant hung in space, its massive bulk unable to follow. "We made it," I whispered. Lyra unbuckled her harness and floated over to me in the zero-G, her skin shimmering with colors I'd never seen before. Relief and joy, and something that looked like the aurora borealis made flesh. "You did it," she said. "You flew us through an impossible gap while spinning at 7 degrees per second. The probability of success was 0.003%. "Then I guess we're 0.003% kind of people," I said. She pressed her forehead against mine, and I felt the warmth of her skin, the vibration of her oral spires. "We are alive, Thaddeus, against all mathematics and logic and reason. We are alive." The moment of peace lasted exactly 11 seconds. Then the proximity alarm started screaming. "What now?" I pulled up the sensor display and felt my blood turn to ice. "Boarding craft, 3 of them. They're coming in on foot." Lyra's skin shifted to diamond white, the color of combat readiness. "Vale is not giving up. He cannot follow with the Vigilant, so he is sending tactical teams." I looked at the ethel glass containment unit, still glowing with that golden light, pulsing with the heartbeat of an entire civilization. "We can't let them take it." "I know. Lyra, listen to me. You need to take the glass and go deeper into the reef. Hide in the crystal formations. I'll hold them here as long as I can." "Absolutely not," she said, her multi-tonal voice taking on a hard edge I'd never heard before. "We survive together or not at all. Be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. You are a navigator with basic hand-to-hand training. I am a crystallian with combat-rated reflexes and a density advantage of 300%. If anyone is holding the line, it should be me." "Then we both hold it," I said, "together." The first boarding craft attached to our hull with a magnetic clang that echoed through the shuttle. I could hear the cutting torches starting to work on the airlock. "They will breach in approximately 90 seconds, Lyra said. "We need weapons." I looked around the cockpit desperately. We had a pulse welder, a few maintenance tools, and our own desperate determination. Against trained Union tactical operators with military-grade weapons, it was laughably inadequate. The cutting continued, a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. I could see the airlock door beginning to glow red. "Lyra," I said quietly, "if this goes badly, I want you to know—" "Do not," she interrupted. "Do not say farewell. We have not come this far, survived this much, to surrender now." She moved to the engineering console and began working with furious speed. "The ethel glass. It is resonating with the reef crystals. The harmonic amplification is extraordinary." "How does that help us?" "The shuttle's reactor can be overloaded. If I channel that energy through the glass into the reef structure—" She looked up at me, her eyes blazing. "I can create a resonance pulse, like what we did when we escaped XP4, but much, much larger." "How much larger?" "Large enough to disable every electronic system within a kilometer radius, including the Vigilant, including the boarding craft, including our own shuttle. So we'd be dead in space, no power, no life support." "Yes, but so would they. And the pulse would destroy Commander Vale's dampener technology. He could not use it against me again." I heard the airlock door crack, the first breach opening. Voices shouted commands on the other side. "Do it," I said. Lyra's fingers flew over the controls. The reactor began to whine, climbing toward dangerous overload. The ethel glass responded, its glow intensifying until it was almost painful to look at. The airlock door blew inward with a detonation that filled the shuttle with smoke and debris. I saw armored figures moving through the haze, weapons raised. And then I saw him. Commander Garrison Vale, stepping through the breach without armor or weapons, just that crisp uniform and those cold blue eyes. "Captain Wright," he said calmly, as if we were meeting over coffee rather than in the wreckage of a forced boarding. Dr. Stellaris, this has gone far enough. Stand down and hand over the ethol glass. I promise you a fair tribunal. Your promises mean nothing, Lyra said, her hand hovering over the reactor override. You would turn my people's salvation into a weapon of genocide. I would turn it into a deterrent, Vale corrected. Do you know how many human colonies have been destroyed by territorial conflicts in the last decade? 17? 4.3 million dead. If the threat of resonance weapons prevents even one more war, then yes, I will bear that moral burden. He took a step closer, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not cruelty or greed, but genuine conviction. The zealotry of a man who believed he was saving lives. My son Thomas was 12 years old when he died in the energy crisis, Vale continued quietly. The station's life support failed because 3 different factions couldn't agree on resource allocation. I held him as he suffocated. I felt him go cold in my arms. So you'll forgive me, Doctor, if I don't care about the philosophical niceties of your people's sovereignty. I care about making sure no other father has to bury his child because we lack the power to enforce peace. Peace enforced through fear is not peace, Lyra said. It is merely delayed violence. Perhaps, Vale said, but delayed violence means some children grow up. Some fathers don't have to dig graves. That's enough for me. His hand moved toward his belt, and I saw it. A small black device. The resonance dampener. Don't make me use this, he said. It will cause Dr. Stellaris considerable pain. And that doesn't bother you? I asked the no. Sester, everything I do bothers me, Captain Wright. But I do it anyway. That's what duty means. Lyra looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the question. The reactor was at critical levels. One more command and the pulse would trigger. We would disable the vigilant, destroy Vale's dampener, and probably die in the aftermath when our life support failed. Or we could surrender, hand over the glass, let 8 billion crystallians slowly fade into silence over the next 9 years. I thought about the colony transport, about the rounding error, about 8 years of running from my own conscience, about how I'd become so afraid of making mistakes that I'd stopped making choices at all. Lyra, I said, activate the pulse. Her hand came down on the override. The reactor shrieked, a sound like reality tearing itself apart. The ethel glass exploded with light, not destructive light, but something else, something that existed in frequencies beyond visible spectrum. The energy poured out of the containment unit and into the shuttle systems, then through the hull and into the crystalline structures of Sirena's reef. The mountain began to sing. It started as a low hum, barely audible, but it built with terrifying speed. The individual crystals surrounding us began to vibrate in sympathy with the ethel glass, each one adding its voice to the growing chorus. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly in my bones, my teeth, the fluid in my skull. Vale's dampener exploded in his hand with a shower of sparks. He staggered backward, his cold composure finally cracking as he looked around at the singing mountain with something approaching fear. The pulse expanded outward like a wave of visible music. I saw it wash over the boarding craft attached to our hull, watch their systems die in cascading failures. It reached the Vigilant, and the mighty cruiser went dark, its weapon arrays falling silent, its engines cutting out. And then it reached beyond, spreading through the calidrious expanse in an expanding sphere of harmonic energy that left every electronic system it touched completely inert. Inside the Scarab 7, the lights went out. Life support died. The temperature began to drop immediately. In the sudden silence, I heard Vale laugh, a bitter, exhausted sound. Well played, Captain. You've killed us all to make your point. I hope your principles keep you warm. The pulse was not meant to kill, Lyra said, her skin glowing with its own internal light, bright enough to see by in the darkness. It was meant to speak. Speak to whom? Vale demanded. To them. I looked out the viewport and saw them coming. Ships, dozens of them emerging from the deeper reaches of the reef where they'd been waiting. They were crystalline vessels, smaller than the Vigilant, but elegant, all flowing lines and crystalline hulls that sang with their own internal harmonics. The pulse was a signal, Lyra explained, a frequency my people have been listening for. I told them that if I found the ethel glass, I would activate it in a specific pattern. They have been waiting at the edge of your Union space for 3 weeks. ready to retrieve me. The Crystallian ships moved through the dead debris field with graceful precision, ignoring the drifting, vigilant, and the powerless boarding craft. One of them, larger than the others, bearing markings I couldn't read, approached the Scarab 7 and extended a docking tube. "You planned this," Vale said, his voice hollow. "From the beginning." "I planned for every contingency," Lara replied, "including the one where you prove my people's opinion of me correct, that I am resourceful enough to save them, despite being flawed." The docking tube connected with a soft thud. Air hissed into our dead shuttle, warm and breathable. The airlock opened and figures emerged, more Crystallians, their skin shimmering with colors of greeting. But Lyra didn't move toward them. She looked at me. "Come with me," she said. "What?" "Come with me to the Crystallian homeworld. Help me restore the great resonance. Help me save my people." Her hand found mine in the darkness. "Help me prove that a flawed queen and a broken navigator can do impossible things together." I looked at Commander Vale, standing in the wreckage of his plans with empty hands and defeated eyes. I looked at the Prometheus Dawn, somewhere beyond the reef, where Chief Shaw and Captain Blackwood and all the familiar faces waited. I looked at the Crystallian ships, alien and beautiful and terrifying in their otherness. And I looked at Lyra, who had trusted me to fly blind through a gravitational hell, who had believed I was more than my mistakes, who had shown me that the only unforgivable error was refusing to try. "Your people think you're flawed," I said. "They're going to love finding out they were wrong." I took her hand and walked toward the Crystallian ship, leaving behind the Prometheus Dawn, the Vigilant, and every safe choice I might have made. Behind us, I heard Vale call out, "Right, you're making a mistake." I paused at the airlock, looked back. "Commander, I've spent 8 years being terrified of mistakes. I'm done. Maybe this is the right choice. Maybe it's catastrophically wrong, but it's mine, and I'm making it anyway. They'll court-martial you in absentia. Your name will be synonymous with treason." "Better than being synonymous with coward," I said. "Better than spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." We crossed into the Crystallian vessel, and the airlock sealed behind us. The ship's interior was like nothing I'd ever seen. Walls that seemed to be made of living crystal, pulsing with gentle bioluminescence. The air smelled like ozone and distant rain. A Crystallian approached Lyra, his skin a deep emerald green, his aural spires adorned with what looked like ceremonial metal bands. He spoke in their harmonic language, and I couldn't understand a word. But I understood Lyra's response. She stood straighter, her skin shifting from exhausted blue to brilliant gold. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority I'd never heard before. The voice of someone who had stopped apologizing for existing. The Emerald Crystallian bowed. The others followed suit. "What did you say?" I whispered. "I told them that I am Queen Lyra Stellaris, bearer of the great resonance, and that they will never call me flawed again." She looked at me, and her smile was fierce and beautiful. "I also told them that the human beside me is under my personal protection, and anyone who questions his presence will answer to me." "Queen," I said, "you didn't mention that part." "You never asked." The ship began to move, pulling away from the reef and accelerating toward the outer reaches of the system. Through the transparent sections of the hull, I watched the Vigilant grow smaller, watched the Caladrius expanse fade behind us. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Home," Lyra said, "to the Crystallian hegemony, to show them what their expendable queen accomplished. To restore the resonance and save 8 billion lives." She paused. "And then perhaps to find out what happens when a flawed queen and a broken navigator have time to discover who they are beyond their mistakes." I looked out at the stars streaking past, at the impossible journey stretching ahead, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Hope. "You know," I said, "I never did get that proper date, the one that doesn't involve dying asteroids or genocidal military commanders." Lyra laughed, a sound like crystal bells singing. "I think we can arrange that. Though I should warn you, Crystallian courtship rituals are extremely complicated. There are 17 different formal ceremonies, each with specific harmonic requirements." 17? I groaned. Maybe the asteroid wasn't so bad after all. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt the warm vibration of her oral spires against my neck. Fortunately, you have approximately 3 months of travel time to learn them. I am told I am an excellent teacher. 3 months stuck on a ship with you, learning alien dating customs, I said. Sounds like the kind of mathematically improbable scenario I've gotten really good at lately. Indeed, she murmured. Though I should mention one other thing. What's that? When we arrive at the Crystallian homeworld, you will be the first human most of my people have ever seen. They will be extremely curious. You will likely be examined, questioned, and subjected to countless cultural exchanges. Great, I said. No pressure. And, she continued, her skin flickering with mischief, you will be introduced as the Queen's consort. I froze. Consort, as in the person who holds the Queen's affection and shares her residence. Her faceted eyes met mine. Unless you would prefer a different designation? I thought about it for approximately half a second. Consort works, though I feel like there should be some kind of formal ceremony or... She kissed me. It was nothing like kissing a human. Her lips were crystalline, warm, and the contact sent harmonic frequencies cascading through my entire nervous system. It felt like music and light and falling and flying all at once. When she pulled back, I couldn't remember what I'd been about to say. Consider that the first ceremony, she said. Only 16 more to go. The Crystallian ship jumped to faster than light, and the universe outside became a blur of impossible colors. Somewhere behind us, Commander Vale was probably radiating fury aboard his dead cruiser, waiting for recovery. Somewhere ahead, an entire civilization was about to discover their queen had returned with salvation in hand. But in that moment, standing in a corridor made of living crystal with an alien queen who taught me to fly blind and trust my heart, I didn't care about any of it. For the first time since I'd made a 0.004% error that ended my career, I wasn't thinking about the mistakes I'd made or the ones I might make. I was thinking about what I'd gotten right. Hey, Lyra, I said. Yes. I'm really glad you caught me staring. Her skin pulsed with that rose gold light of affection. I am glad I recorded the data. It proved to be an extremely worthwhile observation. We stood there in the crystalline corridor, two fundamentally flawed beings who had somehow found each other across the vast, improbable darkness of space. We had saved a civilization, escaped a fleet, and threaded an impossible needle at 3,000 kilometers per hour. And now we had 3 months to figure out what came next. I figured with our track record, we'd probably manage something spectacular, or catastrophic, possibly both. But whatever it was, we'd do it together.